Hi there, this is Teresa Eicher with Counseling and Wellness Services of Archibald. We are in partnership with Jill Holgrave Wellness Consulting, and I hope you're having a wonderful week. Just wanting to come back and have some discussion about healthy relationships and conflict resolution, and spend a little bit of time on what we call the Four Horsemen. Again, this is something that has come out of the Gottman Institute and the research by John Gottman. And he and his wife do a lot of research and kind of summarize what are the characteristics that tend to be problematic in relationships, whether that's a marriage, whether that's a coworker, a parent-child relationship, just what kind of traits are there that tend to be destructive in those relationships and really like threaten the relationship, increase the probability of that relationship being severed. And so, if you remember last week, we hit on two of those out of the four. We had some discussion about criticism and just the difference between criticism and complaining, and how with criticism, we tend to make comments that are more about how we value the individual or more of a reflection of how we perceive their value. So a lot of times those comments are more cutting along the way. Whereas a complaint is, we might have some thoughts or feelings about a behavior or a situation, but we don't necessarily draw that as a reflection of the individual. We recognize that mistakes happen, grace is necessary, and that really a lot of times we can just share our thoughts, feelings, and opinions, and that can problem solve and create change within the individual or the situation. The other one that we hit on was contempt. A lot of times when I think about contempt for an individual, it's really mean behavior towards someone, disrespect, mean behavior. And a lot of times people will tell me that they feel like their partner or the individual they're in relationship with is kind of making a character assassination. So, where criticism might be one comment, contempt tends to be just kind of this mean, snarky approach. And there might be lots of comments that target the value of the individual. And that's obviously really hard when we love and care about someone, when we do life with someone, when we see someone day to day, knowing that they don't value our essence, that can be hard to be in relationship with them. It also requires us to have a pretty strong ego and self-confidence about ourselves, to be able to reject that and not take that on, and maybe spiral into anxiety. So just a little bit of a recap there. Today, what we are going to be moving into is defensiveness and stonewalling. And to some degree, they kind of go hand in hand with criticism and contempt. So a lot of times when we feel like we are being criticized, or even with contempt, heavily criticized, we have a tendency then to respond with defensiveness. They make a comment that might feel cutting, and then we respond in an effort to defend ourselves. The problem with defensiveness, one doesn't justify the other. So if we're approached with criticism or approached with contempt, that doesn't necessarily justify defensiveness. We understand where it comes from, obviously, and our hope would be that both parties would improve their communication. But a lot of times with defensiveness, what we're essentially doing is we're, creating excuses. We're justifying, we're rationalizing why a behavior, why an action is okay along the way. And so many times our partner or the other person that we're communicating with really just kind of looks at that and says, you're unwilling to understand me. You're unwilling to accept responsibility. You're unwilling to just accept your part in this behavior, in this situation. And, obviously, no one likes to feel misunderstood. No one likes to kind of observe the other person, not take responsibility for actions or behaviors. I think we all feel more understood when someone can say to us, I don't necessarily like what you're saying and I don't like what I'm being called out on, but I can see where you're at in it. I can see why you don't like that. I can see, what your experience was like in that. And I hold responsibility in that. Like, I need to take responsibility. I need to own that. Obviously, if we're making an apology and we're accepting ownership, we then also probably have to consider what we're willing to do differently in the future, so that we don't have repeated experiences like this. Um, I think it's also fair to say to your partner, I certainly understand where you're at in this, and I can take ownership for my part in it. But I'm also going to ask you, as you share feedback with me, can you be more respectful in that? Can you be more tender? Can you be more loving? I think it's okay to ask both parties to step in, if the complaint is valid, and yet it's been presented through criticism. The other is stonewalling. So stonewalling actually is something that over a period of time tends to develop. So when we see that a relationship is heavy on criticism and contempt, we tend to see that people build walls. And stonewalling is just kind of that. It's a strong stone wall, that we don't really allow people to penetrate. So I tell people, like, it's okay to have boundaries, but if you think of a boundary as a wall, there has to be a door. So we have to give one another access, to ourselves, so that we can work together, so that we can problem solve, so that we can do life together, essentially. And so when a partner comes in or an individual comes in and they're heavy on the criticism, and we start kind of building that wall up, what that oftentimes looks like is just a disengagement, right? So maybe they physically walk away from the conversation. Maybe they shut down and they just stop replying. But oftentimes through body language, through actions, we can see that there is a withdrawal or a disengagement that goes on. And the problem with that is that it really shuts down communication. A lot of times people will say to me, like, I feel like my partner is disengaged. They're not even a participant, in reconciling the issue or problem solving what I'm bringing to them. They talk about how sometimes that can really lead them to feel hopeless or helpless within the situation and not necessarily see how this improves over time. And we have to understand that when people engage in stonewalling, when they disengage, many times they're pretty overwhelmed. Sometimes there's a physiological anxiety response that's going on within them, that can move them into kind of fight, flight, freeze. So in this scenario with stonewalling, we're probably more in the freeze realm. So not discounting what's going on for that person and their experience, but also leaving that door open to where we can say to the other person, I see that you seem really overwhelmed right now. What do you need? Do we need to come back to this? If so, can we set up a time for that, right? Or even the partner who is overwhelmed in that moment, being willing to open up that door and say, I'm really shutting down. I feel overwhelmed in this moment. And so I don't necessarily think this is the moment to have a big conversation about it. I'm wondering if I can maybe just take some space and collect myself. I recognize that when we're in good spaces, those are easy things to say. So sometimes I encourage, when this is a pattern in a relationship, that people talk about how they are going to handle those instances when they come up. So when we're in good times, I might say, there are just times when we talk about problems that come up that I feel incredibly overwhelmed, and I almost just find myself disengaging. It's not that I don't care. I'm just anxious. I'm overwhelmed. And so I just need an opportunity to be able to say, I need an out. And that doesn't mean that we'll never come back and problem solve it. It just means in that moment I can't. And so, maybe then we develop a code word. Maybe the code word is out, right? And so when code word comes up, then we we just allow the out to happen. And we go and we use some healthy coping skills. Maybe we do some reading, maybe we do some breathing, maybe we do some yoga, but maybe we go on a walk, but we use some healthy coping skills to reground ourselves and reestablish regulation. And then I think it's important. I think it's important to come back to the conversation if we're capable of doing it that evening, saying like, hey, I'm ready for this. If we're not capable of doing it that evening, then establishing maybe a day and time. Like, could we do this tomorrow after dinner? Right. I think, partners are okay with pausing. But I especially find when stonewalling is present in a relationship, the other individual just needs reassurance that you're going to come back to it. Because oftentimes in stonewalling, people don't come back. So I hope this information is helpful. I hope this finds you well. And I will see you next week.